Pretend to be my granddaughter for 5 minutes, the ragged old man whispered. Sarah Miller stared at him. She had never seen this man before in her life. She had no idea why he had chosen her from the crowd, and she certainly did not know that before the night was over. This same old man would point toward his wealthy cowboy grandson and make an impossible announcement. "I found you a wife." Sarah would be furious. But first, she had to survive the next 5 minutes. Just an hour earlier, Sarah had been wondering how she would feed her 6-year-old daughter. It was the autumn of 1878 in Abilene, Kansas. A bitter north wind swept through the dusty streets. Winter was coming early that year. The wind carried the dry grit of the endless prairie. Sarah Miller pulled her thin, faded wool shawl tighter against her chest. The fabric was worn through at the elbows. She looked down at her daughter, Lily. Lily was only 6 years old. She shivered beside her mother in a coat too thin for the coming winter. Her cracked boots had been patched with scraps Sarah found behind the cobbler's shop. They were poor, but Sarah had managed to keep her daughter fed, until today. They waited beside the service entrance of the Great Western Hotel. The building was a fortress of red brick and high society. Behind its polished doors, wealthy cattlemen ate hot meals beneath glowing lamps. The wood inside was mahogany, polished until it shone like dark glass. It was a beacon of wealth in a hard, starving land. Sarah had come hoping to sell a basket of wild berries to the kitchen staff. She had picked them along the muddy, dangerous banks of the Smoky Hill River. The brambles had left painful scratches across her hands. Berry juice had stained her fingertips a stubborn blue. She hoped for a few copper pennies. Those pennies were a bridge to another day of life. They meant a bowl of warm cornmeal mush tonight. They meant the difference between sleep and a hollow, gnawing ache in the belly. Sarah was only 26. 2 years earlier, a construction accident had taken her husband, Thomas. It left her with a 6-year-old daughter, a one-room sod house, and debts she could barely pay. Since then, Sarah had survived by working whenever work could be found. She asked for little. She accepted pity from no one. The frontier had been a harsh, relentless teacher. It had carved lines of permanent weariness around her eyes. Her eyes were a bright, startling blue. They were the color of the sky after a violent summer storm. The smell of roasting beef drifted from the kitchen vents. It was a delicious, agonizing smell for a starving child. It made Lily's stomach growl with a sound of pure hunger. Sarah squeezed the girl's small, cold hand. A man stumbled from the shadows of the nearby alleyway. He moved slowly, dragging one foot through the dust. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic, and painful limp. His back was hunched like a weathered, ancient oak tree. His coat was a mosaic of misery and grease. It was held together by mismatched patches and frayed string. His breathing was labored from the biting cold. Whatever had brought him there, the old man had clearly spent too long outside. He leaned heavily on a gnarled wooden walking stick. "Please," the old man wheezed, stopping near them. His voice was a dry, haunting rasp. Sarah stepped forward without a single thought of caution. Her instinct for mercy was faster than her fear. She reached out to steady his trembling frame. "Easy now, sir," she said softly. Her voice was a steady, warm sound in the freezing wind. "Sit here on this old wooden crate." She pointed to a box discarded near the cold brick wall. "You look like the world has been too heavy today." The old man looked up at her with agonizing slowness. His eyes were a sudden, electric surprise. They were piercing, intelligent, and sharp gray. "I'm just so incredibly cold," he whispered. His hands were trembling with a violent force. Lily moved closer to the stranger, her fear forgotten. She touched the old man's tattered sleeve. Her hand was tiny and filled with innocent warmth. "Mama has a little bit of bread left," Lily said. The child looked up at her mother with pleading, hopeful eyes. Sarah did not hesitate for a single moment. There was no conflict in her tired, aching heart. She reached into the deep pocket of her stained apron. She pulled out a small, jagged crust of rye bread. It was dry and hard as a prairie stone. It was supposed to be their only dinner that night. It was the very last thing they had left in the world. She broke the small piece of bread in half. She pressed the larger piece into the man's dirty, trembling palm. "Eat this, sir," she commanded gently. "It isn't much of a meal for a man your age, but it will help your strength last for a little while." The old man stared down at the piece of bread. He looked at it as if it were a bar of solid, pure gold. "You're giving this to me?" he asked. His voice was thick with sudden, heavy emotion. "A stranger who looks like a dog in the street." "I haven't looked respectable in more years than I care to count, child." Sarah smiled at him, a flicker of light in the gloom. "Hunger doesn't care about the dirt on your tired face. We all feel the hunger the same way in the dark." The old man took a small, careful bite. He savored every single grain of the dry, hard rye. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the hotel swung open. A man in a sharp, tailored black suit stepped out. His silk waistcoat caught the golden light of the lamps. "Be off with you at once," the manager barked. He waved a manicured hand as if shooing away flies. "We don't want your kind cluttering the service entrance. Move along before I call for the town marshal." Sarah's face flushed red with a sudden, burning shame. The word beggar stung her soul like a leather lash. She moved to pick up her heavy berry basket, but the old man grabbed her wrist with startling speed. His grip was surprisingly firm and powerful. He looked at the manager with a cold, silent fire. Then he looked back at Sarah, his gaze intense. "Wait," he whispered, his voice gaining strength. "Please, I need a single favor from you. Just 5 minutes of your precious time." Sarah looked at the angry manager. She looked back at the shivering, mysterious old man. "What is it, sir?" she asked. "We really have to go before there is trouble." The old man leaned in close to her ear. His voice dropped to a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Pretend to be my granddaughter for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes of acting, that is all. Walk into that grand, golden lobby with me. Walk like you belong on those fine carpets." Sarah blinked in total confusion. "I don't understand what you mean." "The manager won't let a drifter through the front," he explained. "But he won't stop a man with his family by his side. I have someone I must see inside that grand building." Sarah looked down at Lily. The manager was reaching for a polished silver whistle. "All right," Sarah said, a spark of fire in her eyes. A sudden spark of defiance lit up her tired soul. She was tired of being pushed aside by men in suits. She tucked her messy hair under her bonnet. She straightened the frayed collar of Lily's thin coat. She reached out and took the old man's bony arm. "Come along then, grandfather," she said clearly. She spoke loudly, her voice ringing with authority. The manager paused, his hand frozen in midair. His jaw tightened in a moment of pure shock. Sarah walked with her head held high and proud. She stepped onto the plush, deep red carpet of the lobby. It felt like walking on a warm, soft summer cloud. The heat of the indoor fires hit them like a wave. The lobby smelled of cedar, vanilla, and fine cigars. The old man leaned heavily on her shoulder, but he walked with a new, strange sense of purpose. His hunched back seemed to straighten with every step. They stood in the center of the grand lobby. Crystal chandeliers hung like ice from the high ceiling. They sparkled like 1,000 perfect diamonds. Men in expensive Stetson hats watched them with narrowed eyes. Women in rustling silk dresses whispered behind fans. For 5 minutes, they simply stood there in the golden light. They were a strange, ragged island of poverty. The old man searched the room with sharp, calculating eyes. He scanned every face with cold, mathematical precision. "Is he here?" Sarah whispered, feeling the stares of the wealthy. The old man didn't answer her immediately. He kept his gaze locked on the grand mahogany staircase. Finally, he looked down at Sarah and smiled. He patted her hand with his rough, calloused palm. "You are a truly good woman, Sarah Miller." Sarah froze in place, her blood turning to ice. "How do you know who I am?" she gasped. "I never once told you my name, sir." The old man's expression softened. "Because this wasn't the first time I saw you. Sarah, I've been watching this street for 3 days. Yesterday, you gave your place near the bakery stove to an older woman who was colder than you were. This morning, I asked the baker your name." Sarah stared at him. Whatever game the old man was playing, it had begun long before she noticed him. Looking at this moment as the storyteller, I wanted the hotel lobby to represent more than simple wealth. In frontier cattle towns, clothing, reputation, and who was allowed through a polished front door could say a great deal about social standing. That is why Sarah's decision to walk inside beside a man everyone dismissed matters just as much as the bread she gave him. Before he could explain, a man descended the stairs. He was tall and rugged, with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to hard country. He wore a long, weathered leather duster. It was stained with the red, iron dust of the trail. His face was handsome but hardened by the Kansas sun. His jaw was covered in dark, thick, rugged stubble. The old man let go of Sarah's arm abruptly. The old man slowly straightened. Some of the weakness seemed to fall away, though age still bent his shoulders. When he spoke again, the frail whisper was gone. His voice carried across the lobby with startling authority. It was a booming, clear, and undisputed command. "James," the old man called out. The younger man stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes locked onto the old man with a look of horror. "Grandfather," James asked, his voice cracking, "what in the world are you doing here in Abilene? And why are you dressed like a common, filthy thief?" The old man chuckled. A deep and rich sound, he gestured toward Sarah and little Lily. "James, I told you I would find what this family needed." The old man turned to his grandson, his eyes dancing. "I found you a wife," the old man declared loudly. He pointed a long, bony finger directly at Sarah. The entire lobby went into a tomb-like silence. Every head in the room turned to stare at Sarah. She was a ragged, dirty woman with a shivering child. James looked at her, his gaze traveling slowly. He saw the bright, burning blush on her pale cheeks. He saw the fierce, unyielding pride in her blue eyes. Sarah felt a wave of hot, liquid anger. "I am not a prize to be found by anyone," she snapped. She grabbed Lily's hand with a firm grip. She turned toward the front door to flee the humiliation. But James moved faster than a mountain hawk. He stepped into her path with a single, long stride. "Wait," he said, his voice surprisingly soft and low. "My grandfather is a very difficult, meddling man. And for what it's worth, ma'am, I didn't ask him to find me a wife. I'm sorry he embarrassed you." James looked at her with genuine confusion. He stood like a mountain of solid, unmoving stone. "He's Samuel Sterling," James explained quietly. "He owns one of the largest cattle operations in Kansas. His ranch stretches farther than most men could ride before sundown." Sarah looked back at the old man in total shock. The hotel manager was now bowing low to him. I was offering his deepest and most pathetic apologies. In an instant, the ragged drifter seemed to carry the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Samuel Sterling walked over to them with a smirk. "I wanted to see who would help a man with nothing," Samuel said. He spoke quietly, his voice only for Sarah. "I spent all morning sitting in the dirt of the street. I watched the fine people of Abilene walk by me. They spat on the ground near my frozen feet. But you," he said, his eyes softening, "you gave me your very last piece of dry bread. You stood by me when the manager yelled his threats. You had everything to lose in that moment, and you had absolutely nothing to gain from a beggar." James looked at his grandfather and shook his head. "You could have just asked for a meeting, old man." Samuel looked at Sarah, then back at his grandson. "I wanted to prove something to you, James. You had become so certain that kindness always came with a price that I wanted you to see what genuine goodness looked like. And look at her. James, really look at her. She has the heart of a saint and the grit of a pioneer." Sarah felt like she was being auctioned at a county fair. "I am a widow," she said, her voice firm and hard. "I have a daughter to raise on my own terms. I don't need a husband to save me from the wind. And I certainly don't need a cattle baron's charity." She turned to James, her eyes blazing with fury. He was looking at her with a flickering, deep interest. It wasn't pity she saw in his face. It was a spark of respect. "I'm sorry your grandfather is a meddler. Mr. Sterling, good day to you both. Do not follow me." She marched out of the hotel into the freezing night. Lily was nearly running to keep up with her mother's pace. She went back to her small, lonely sod house. It sat on the dark, empty edge of the town. The walls were damp and smelling of old rain. The floor was nothing but hard-packed dirt. She tucked Lily into their small, freezing bed. The child fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. Sarah sat by the small, cold stone hearth. The fire was slowly dying, gasping for wood. She thought about her husband, Thomas. Thomas had been a good and honest man, and Sarah still missed the quiet safety of his presence. But loneliness would never persuade her to become another man's property. She would rather face winter alone. The next morning was biting, bone-shattering cold. A thick layer of frost covered the dead yellow grass. The sound of a heavy wagon woke her from sleep. She opened her wooden door with a trembling hand. A massive freight wagon sat in her small yard. James Sterling sat on the high, wooden driver's seat. The back of the wagon was piled high with crates. There was white flour, salt, sugar, and slabs of cured salt pork. There were thick, warm, heavy wool blankets. A small wooden rocking horse was tied to the side. It was painted a bright, cheerful red. Sarah stepped out into the biting frost. "I told you I don't want your charity," she said. James jumped down from the wagon with a thud. "It's not charity. Sarah Miller," he said. "My grandfather decided he owes you a profound debt. That piece of bread saved his pride more than his stomach. He told me if I didn't deliver these, he'd disinherit me." James smiled then, and it reached his eyes. "Truth be told, I wanted to come anyway. I wanted to apologize properly for the scene last night. I simply wanted to see you again." Sarah looked at the wagon full of life-saving supplies. "You don't even know me, James," she whispered. "I know you gave your last meal to an old man you thought had nothing," he replied. "That tells me something worth knowing about you." He spent the entire morning unloading the heavy crates. He carried the heaviest sacks while Sarah showed him where everything belonged. Lily came outside into the harsh morning light. She saw the red rocking horse and stopped. She let out a small gasp of delight. Sarah turned away for a moment so Lily would not see the tears in her eyes. For months, survival had taken nearly everything from them. She had almost forgotten what her daughter's laughter sounded like. James heard the child's laughter too. He stopped with a sack of flour still balanced against his shoulder. For several seconds, he simply watched Lily rock back and forth beneath the pale winter sun. There was something almost painful in his expression. Sarah noticed. "You chose the horse?" she asked. James lowered the flour sack beside the doorway. "I did. My grandfather wanted to bring another blanket." Sarah glanced toward the little red horse. "She probably needs the blanket more." "Probably," James smiled. "But children shouldn't have to need only sensible things." The words caught Sarah by surprise. For 2 years, every decision she had made had been about necessity. Food before comfort, firewood before candles, boot leather before ribbons. There had never been enough money left for anything whose only purpose was joy. Lily rocked harder and laughed again. James looked at Sarah. "When my wife was alive, she used to say a house could survive without pretty things." He paused. "But a home couldn't." Sarah said nothing. She was not ready to talk about homes with this man, not after one day. Not after Samuel Sterling had publicly tried to arrange her future as casually as another man might arrange the sale of a horse. Still, she looked at the red rocking horse, then at Lily. "Thank you," she said quietly. James did not smile triumphantly. He did not use her gratitude as an opening. He simply nodded. "You're welcome." That restraint mattered more to Sarah than she wanted to admit. A man with James Sterling's money could have filled her yard with gifts. Instead, he had brought one small thing for a little girl he barely knew. And somehow, he had chosen exactly the right thing. As the sun climbed higher, James paused his work. "My grandfather was acting strange," he admitted. He wanted to see if there was still goodness left. "I am a very lonely man, Sarah. I lost my wife to the fever 4 years ago. It was 4 long, silent years of winter. I thought the ground had taken my heart forever." Sarah felt a sharp pang of sympathy. It was the shared, silent bond of loss. "The fever took many families that year," she said. "I'm not asking for a wedding today, Sarah," James said, "but my ranch is 20 miles north of this spot. It is a good house, built of solid limestone. My grandfather lives there as well. Mrs. Whitaker keeps the kitchen and has worked for our family for 20 years. You and Lily would have rooms of your own. You'd be my employee. Sarah. Nothing more unless you ever chose otherwise. Sarah looked at Lily, playing in the frost. The child looked so small against the vast, hungry sky. The sod house would not survive another blizzard. I'll work for honest wages, James, Sarah said. But understand me clearly. I will earn my place there. I will not be bought with flour and salt, James nodded solemnly. Then honest wages it is, shake on it. Sarah did not take his hand immediately. What happens if this doesn't work? James seemed surprised by the question. If what doesn't work, the job, she looked him directly in the eye, or your grandfather's plans for us. James understood. He pulled a small leather purse from his coat and placed it on the wagon seat between them. 2 weeks' wages in advance. Sarah frowned. You haven't seen my work. No, I haven't, James admitted. But I've seen you refuse charity when you desperately needed it. He nodded toward the purse. That isn't charity, it's wages. And if I decide to leave, I'll bring you and Lily back to Abilene myself. Sarah studied his face. No arguments. No arguments. No Samuel following us with another scheme. James almost smiled. I can't promise what my grandfather will do, but I can promise what I will do. Sarah finally extended her hand. James took it carefully. His grip was firm but brief. No lingering touch. No attempt to turn a business agreement into something more. For reasons Sarah could not explain, that made her trust him a little. Lily had wandered over with the red rocking horse clutched awkwardly beneath one arm. Is the horse coming too? James looked solemnly at the child. I don't believe we could leave such an important member of the family behind. Lily hugged the wooden horse tighter. Sarah almost corrected his use of the word family. Almost. Instead, she turned toward the sod house and began deciding what little they owned was worth carrying into a new life. The move to the ranch was a long, cold journey. The house was massive, grand, and imposing. It was built of stone to last for many generations. Samuel Sterling was there to greet them on the porch. He looked triumphant and entirely too smug. Welcome home, granddaughter, he said with a grin. Sarah gave him a sharp, warning look. I am the bookkeeper, Mr. Sterling. Don't forget that. Samuel just laughed a hearty, booming laugh. We'll see about that, my dear girl. The weeks that followed were incredibly busy. Sarah took over the heavy, leather-bound ledgers. She found the ranch's finances were a chaotic mess. She was sharp, organized, and utterly relentless. James watched her with growing, silent admiration. Sarah noticed his attention, but she refused to mistake gratitude for love. She knew what it cost to give another person a permanent place in her heart. James seemed to understand. He never pressed her. He simply kept showing up. A repaired hinge, a bucket of warm water left outside her door, an extra blanket tucked around Lily when the child fell asleep. Little by little, Sarah stopped seeing Samuel Sterling's grandson. She began seeing James. One reason I wanted their relationship to grow through ordinary chores is that frontier life rarely left much room for grand romantic gestures. Trust was often revealed in smaller things: reliable work, a repaired home, shared responsibility, and simply being there when someone needed help. For Sarah, those quiet acts were slowly becoming more persuasive than anything James could have said. Lily noticed the change before Sarah did. At first, the child followed her mother everywhere. If Sarah carried ledgers into the front room, Lily sat beneath the table. If Sarah went to the pantry, Lily followed. If James entered a room unexpectedly, Lily immediately moved closer to her mother. James never complained. He never tried to win the child with expensive presents after the rocking horse. Instead, he gave her small jobs. He showed her how to brush the gentlest mare in the stable. He let her carry a tin cup of oats to an old pony that had long since retired from ranch work. When she asked endless questions, he answered everyone as seriously as if she were a grown ranch hand. Why do horses sleep standing up? Sometimes they lie down too. Do cows know their names? Some seem to. Does that pony like me? James considered the question carefully. He likes anyone who brings oats. Lily frowned. Then he doesn't really like me. James crouched so they were almost eye to eye. Give him time. Trust isn't the same thing as hunger. Sarah heard him say it from the stable doorway. She wondered whether he was still speaking about the pony. One cold afternoon, Lily slipped while carrying a small bucket across the yard. The bucket spilled. So did the child. Sarah started toward her. James reached Lily first, but instead of scooping her up immediately, he crouched beside her. Anything hurt? Lily shook her head, embarrassed. Then I reckon you can stand. He offered one hand. Lily took it and pulled herself upright. There you go. He helped her refill the bucket and walked beside her without taking it away. Sarah watched from the porch. Thomas had done things like that. He had always believed helping a child did not mean doing everything for her. The memory struck Sarah unexpectedly. For a moment, the ranch yard seemed to blur. She turned away before anyone could see her face. That evening, she found James splitting kindling behind the house. You were good with her today. James kept his eyes on the wood. She's a good girl. She likes you. His axe stopped. That simple sentence seemed to affect him more than any compliment Sarah had given him. I like her too. He looked toward the kitchen window, where Lily's small silhouette moved through the lamplight. I know I'm not her father. Sarah's shoulders stiffened, James noticed immediately. And I'm not trying to be. The tension left her slowly. Good. But if she needs someone to hold a bucket while she fills it, I can do that. Sarah smiled despite herself. Apparently you're highly qualified. For buckets. For buckets. It was the first time they laughed together without Samuel anywhere nearby. She convinced him to set aside a sunny patch for a vegetable garden when spring returned. Winter came unevenly that year. Several early freezes had already crusted the river with ice, but 2 unexpectedly mild days weakened it before the temperature plunged again. One evening, the first real snow began to fall. James was repairing a worn leather bridle by lantern light. Sarah sat nearby, finishing the day's ranch accounts. Why did you really come to Abilene that night? Sarah asked. James paused in his work, his hands stilling. My grandfather was testing my eyes as much as your heart. He wanted to see if I could see value in a beggar. And did you see it? Sarah asked softly. James put down the leather and looked at her. I saw a woman stronger than any man I know, he said. I see someone I don't want to live without. Sarah felt a hot, silent tear prick her eye. Sarah lowered her eyes to the ledger. James, don't say things like that unless you mean them. I don't know how to say them unless I mean them. She closed the book. The sound seemed strangely loud in the quiet room. You lost a wife. And I lost a husband, James nodded. I know. Then you know what happens when you build your whole life around another person. Her voice weakened. One morning they're there, and one afternoon they aren't. James did not reach for her. Sarah was grateful for that. I spent 2 years teaching myself not to need anyone, he continued. I learned how to mend a roof badly enough to keep rain off Lily's bed. I learned how to stretch flour until bread hardly tasted like bread anymore. I learned to sleep through every strange sound outside the door because there was no one else to wake. She looked at him. Do you understand how frightening it is to discover I may not want to live that way anymore? James's expression changed. The confidence left it. What remained was simply a lonely man listening to a lonely woman. Yes, he said, because I'm frightened too. Sarah had expected reassurance, perhaps even a promise. His honesty affected her more. James looked toward the snow gathering beyond the window. I can't promise you the land won't take something from us again. I can't promise there won't be another fever, another winter, or another day that scares us half to death. He looked back at her. All I can promise is that if you ever choose me, you won't have to face those days alone. Sarah's eyes filled. For one dangerous second, she nearly reached across the table and took his hand. But before she could speak, a rider appeared. He was galloping hard through the deepening snow. The lower meadow, the man shouted. An ice jam broke upstream. The river's rising fast. Oh, the cattle are trapped against the flooded bank. James was on his feet in a single second. Sarah, stay here in the house with Lily. He jumped onto his horse and spurred it forward. The night was a terrifying, howling nightmare. Sarah could hear the cattle lowing in the distance. It was a sound of pure terror. She knew the lower meadow was a frozen death trap. She wrapped herself in her heaviest wool coat. She told Samuel to watch the child by the fire. "I'm going to help him," Sarah shouted back into the wind. She found them by the swollen, angry riverbank. The current was black, fast, and littered with broken ice. The men were struggling against the killing current. James was shivering violently, his face pale. His strength was clearly failing him in the cold. Sarah reached the riverbank and stopped cold. For one terrible second, fear locked her legs beneath her. Then she saw James stumble. Sarah grabbed the wet hemp rope from one of the ranch hands. "Wrap it around that cottonwood," she shouted. 2 men obeyed. Sarah braced herself beside them and pulled. Her hands burned against the wet rope. She was terrified, but she refused to let go. One by one, the trapped cattle were guided and pulled toward safer ground. The wet rope tore painfully against their palms. Slowly, the last steer reached solid ground. James collapsed on the bank, gasping for air. Sarah crawled to him on her hands and knees. She wrapped her arms around him with all her might. "You're a fool, James Sterling," she sobbed. "I couldn't let them go," he whispered into her hair. "They're our future, Sarah, Lily's future." In that frozen moment, she finally knew the truth. They were becoming a family, bound by choice and tested by winter. Neither of them needed to say it yet. They both knew. They managed to stagger back to the warm stone house. Samuel was waiting with dry blankets and a roar. The old man looked at them both in the firelight. He smiled a smile of pure, quiet joy. "I think 5 minutes was all I really needed," he whispered. Sarah heard him. So did James. Neither answered. Mrs. Whitaker hurried them toward the fire and wrapped another blanket around Sarah's shoulders. Lily came running from the hallway. "Mama!" Sarah dropped to her knees. The child collided with her so hard that Sarah nearly lost her balance. "I'm all right." Lily buried her face against the wet wool of her coat. "You said you were helping." "I was." "You didn't say helping was dangerous." Sarah closed her eyes. Children had a cruel way of finding the exact truth adults preferred to avoid. "I'm sorry." Lily pulled back and looked toward James. He was sitting near the hearth, pale with cold. For the first time since Sarah had known her, Lily did not hesitate. She crossed the room and climbed onto the bench beside him. "You came back too." James looked at the child. "Barely." Lily frowned. "Don't do that again." Despite everything, James laughed. "I'll try." Samuel stood near the mantel, unusually silent. The old man's earlier satisfaction was gone. Sarah noticed his hands trembling. Not from cold this time. Later, after Lily had fallen asleep, Sarah found Samuel alone near the window. "You were frightened, Jesse," she said. Samuel continued staring into the darkness. "I've buried a wife." His voice was quiet. "I've buried a son." Sarah had never heard him mention James's father. "I have no desire to bury my grandson." For once, there was no mischief in Samuel Sterling. No scheme, no smile, just an old man suddenly looking every year of his age. Sarah moved beside him. "You love him very much." "More than I've ever been clever enough to tell him." Samuel glanced toward the room where James slept. "I thought finding him a wife might bring him back to life." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That may have been the worst possible way to accomplish it." Samuel sighed. "I'm beginning to understand that." Then Sarah surprised herself by smiling. "Only beginning." The old man's familiar grin returned. "There she is." "Who?" "My granddaughter." Sarah rolled her eyes, but this time she did not correct him. The long winter passed with agonizing slowness. One evening, James found Lily asleep beside the hearth. The red rocking horse was tucked against her chair. He lifted the child carefully and carried her toward her room. Lily stirred against his shoulder. "Mr. James." Lily's sleepy eyes opened only halfway. "Will you still be here when I wake up?" James stopped. Sarah stood silently in the doorway. "If your mother will have me," he said softly. "I'd like to be here for every morning I can." Lily smiled and rested her head against his shoulder again. Sarah had to look away. This time, it was not fear that made her heart ache. The next morning, Sarah woke before sunrise. For several minutes, she did not know what had awakened her. Then she heard a soft scraping sound outside. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. James was repairing one of the loose boards near the steps. You know, most people sleep before sunrise. He looked up. Most people don't have a board that squeaks loud enough to wake a whole house. Sarah leaned against the porch post. Lily asked about you last night. I know. You gave her quite an answer. James set down the hammer. I meant it. Sarah looked across the sleeping ranch. I spent a long time believing that loving Thomas once meant I had already been given my share. James remained silent. Like asking for happiness twice would somehow make the first happiness less important. It wouldn't. No, Sarah said softly. She looked at him. I'm starting to understand that. James stood. He was close enough now that Sarah could see the exhaustion beneath his eyes. Still, he waited. He always waited. Sarah reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had done it without necessity. No river, no bargain, no Samuel, just choice. James looked down at their joined hands. Sarah, don't ruin it by talking. His mouth curved into a smile. Yes, ma'am. They stood like that while the first light spread slowly across the prairie. Inside the house, something bumped loudly. Then came Lily's sleepy voice. Mama! Sarah laughed and released James's hand. Duty calls. James opened the door for her. As she passed him, Sarah paused. James, yes. When spring comes, I think Lily and I would like to plant more than vegetables. He looked puzzled. What else? Roots. She went inside before he could answer. For the rest of the morning, James Sterling wore the expression of a man trying very hard not to smile. A few weeks later, the last snow disappeared from the hills. James asked Sarah to walk with him beyond the stone porch. The first green shoots were beginning to rise from the garden patch she had chosen months before. James stopped beside the fence and took off his hat. Sarah, my grandfather tried to choose a wife for me before I had even learned your name. She smiled despite herself. That sounds like Samuel. James reached into his coat and took out a simple gold ring. But this is my choice. And more importantly, it has to be yours. He looked at her steadily. I don't want a housekeeper, and I don't want someone simply because I'm afraid of being alone. I want you beside me because this place only feels like home when you and Lily are in it. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Then ask me properly, James Sterling. His nervous smile appeared. Sarah Miller, will you marry me? She let him wait one heartbeat. Yes. From somewhere behind the porch railing came Lily's delighted laugh. Samuel's louder laugh followed immediately after it. News of the engagement traveled faster than Sarah expected. Within a week, half of Abilene seemed to know. The same town that had once watched her stand outside the Great Western Hotel with a basket of berries now watched her walk beside James Sterling with her head held high. Some people whispered. Sarah had expected that. What surprised her was how little it mattered. One afternoon, she passed the hotel manager on the boardwalk. He recognized her immediately. His smile became stiff. Mrs. Miller, sir? His eyes shifted toward James, then toward the Sterling wagon waiting nearby. I trust circumstances have improved. Sarah looked at the polished hotel doors. She remembered Lily shivering beside her. She remembered a crust of bread. And she remembered how small the manager had once made her feel. My circumstances were never the measure of my worth. The manager's face reddened. Sarah continued down the boardwalk. James caught up with her. What did he say? Nothing worth remembering. James offered his arm. Sarah looked at it. Then she took it. Across the street? Samuel watched them from beneath the brim of his hat. He looked unbearably pleased with himself. Sarah pointed one warning finger in his direction. Samuel immediately looked away and pretended to study a horse. James laughed. You're never going to let him take credit for this, are you? Absolutely not. Even a little. Sarah considered. 5 minutes. James laughed harder. It was strange, Sarah thought. How a memory that had once filled her with humiliation could become something warm when enough love grew around it. The old man had opened the door, but she and James had chosen to walk through it together. The ranch flourished under their combined care. On a bright, golden Sunday in June, the town gathered. Sarah wore a dress of ivory silk and lace. It was a secret gift from old Samuel. Lily walked down the aisle with a wide smile. She threw petals of wild, fragrant prairie roses. James stood at the simple wooden altar. He looked like a man who was finally, truly home. Samuel sat in the front row, weeping openly. He leaned over to a neighbor in the pew. "I found her in the dirt and the wind, you know. She's the greatest treasure in the whole state of Kansas." James took Sarah's hands in his own. "I promise to earn your heart every single day," he said. Sarah looked at him and saw her entire world. "I promise to be the partner who stands by you." Their kiss was gentle and unhurried. It marked the beginning of a life they had chosen to build together. Years later, Sarah would sit on the wide stone porch with her grandchildren gathered around her. She would tell them about a freezing evening in Abilene, about a ragged old man, about the last piece of bread she had to give, and about the strangest 5 minutes of her life. Samuel's portrait still hung inside the stone house, but Sarah never remembered him for his cattle or his land. She remembered the old man who taught them that a person's greatest wealth could never be measured in acres. Sometimes, she told her grandchildren, the smallest act of kindness opens a door you never knew was there. And sometimes, 5 borrowed minutes can change the rest of your life. If Sarah's story touched your heart, subscribe and join us for more stories of love, courage, and second chances from the American frontier. And tell us in the comments, has one small act of kindness ever changed your life? Thank you for watching. This fictional Western romance is inspired by life on the 19th century American frontier. Characters and events have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. AI tools may have assisted parts of the creative process, with the final story and presentation reviewed and directed by the channel creator.